Now, I didn't know about this case, so I was super excited when Netflix announced that they were continuing with the crime scene documentary series. And this time, the focus is on the Times Square killer. Seemingly random acts of brutality shock even the most seasoned New York City homicide detectives, stoking fears of an elusive serial killer operating within 1970s era Times Square, a near lawless sexual playground where forbidden fantasies were fulfilled, including murder. We got the first series of Crime Scene when they focused on the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles and the case of a young woman who had disappeared. And while I had fun with that one, there were portions that just didn't quite click for me. But I was curious to check out this new case as it was a brand new one to me. The crux of the story focuses on two women who are found murdered in a hotel room that's been set ablaze. And what's done to their bodies is pretty horrifying and it disgusts, but also baffles the police. And as new cases begin to emerge with some similarities to these other killings, the police begin to believe that they have a serial killer on their hands. Now, the backdrop for this case is Times Square in New York in the 1970s, where peep shows, swing clubs, adult theaters, and all manners of sex-centered businesses popped up and then began to thrive. There was also a prevalence of sex workers in the Times Square area, and because they were looked down upon by police and then even most of society, they were seen as disposable, or even worse, invisible, if a crime were to happen to them. The documentary is shown in 3 episodes that are each around 50 minutes long, and there's a great deal of attention given to the Times Square area so that we can get a good understanding of the landscape where these crimes occurred. We get interviews with detectives, psychologists, reporters, attorneys, sex workers, victims, and even victim family members. I found the majority of the storytelling to be very engaging and quite interesting. It was intriguing to see how the area changed and then began to flourish as a porn capital. Now, I went to Times Square a handful of years ago, and it was incredibly bright with lights, and it was surprisingly clean and safe. I mean, you'd never guess that it once housed so many adult-themed businesses. The interviews are well constructed and then put together to tell a good, cohesive story. And as the crime is being followed, recounted by retired detectives and forensic experts, we get accounts from also former sex workers, journalists, and historians about the culture of the area and how that played a large part in the crimes that are being able to be committed in the first place. The opportunity was there for predators of all kinds, and while a lot flew under the radar, this one particular case rightfully grabbed the attention of both cops and the media. Now, some of the interviews are pretty entertaining too. There's this one guy who helps shed light on the case and a suspect, and he's rather funny in his delivery. I mean, he's pretty matter of fact, and his sarcastic or maybe even dry delivery made me chuckle a few times. And something that I appreciate in this series versus the previous crime scene show is that amateur detectives aren't part of the storytelling. The accounts we get come from the investigators themselves, working off of the evidence, or even lack of evidence, to try and catch the killer. Now, I didn't always buy some of the posturings from former detectives, but I think that's the beauty of hindsight. They can now give the account with the details that they now know, making them sound like they were more ahead in the case than they actually were when it was going on. There are some reenactments for scenarios, but I was surprised at the amount of archival footage that exists of Times Square at this time. There's also a great deal of photographs shown, but when it's all combined, it does feel like we've been transported back to the 70s as all of this is unfolding. And I do appreciate that this case has an ending to it and a resolution, but truthfully, I'm not sure I agree with all of the solutions. I still have a lot of questions regarding the case, and because this is sort of presented as a documentary/investigative journalism piece, having some big questions that are unanswered felt dissatisfying. The story presents some large questions related to the initial case that are left hanging, particularly in how the bodies were found and the lack of certain evidence, and no one ever answered them, which may not be a big deal when it comes to conviction or acquittal, but when a story brings up a point and it doesn't answer, it becomes frustrating. That being said, though, I do appreciate the way certain portions of the case are ongoing. And one individual, and it was a surprise that they were initiating the process, was working to uncover more and provide closure for families. Now, the end of the documentary seems to lose focus on the case, opting instead to tell the story of Times Square, including how it transitioned and then cleaned up. And a decent amount of information is devoted to showing the progress to what it is today. Now, this is all interesting info, but I don't think it's the way to wrap up the show. And I know that Times Square is a character itself within this story, but by the end, this felt like at points it was more of a documentary on Times Square than on the killings by the serial killer. Overall, it's still a great watch. The presentation is very informative and gives some great insight into the culture of Times Square, where this killer was able to flourish in his crimes. And if you're a fan of true crime, I think you're going to enjoy this. If you're already familiar with this case, though, I'm not sure how much of the information is going to be new, but the inclusion of what could be called the rise and fall and then rise again of Times Square certainly makes for some entertaining viewing. There's a lot of sex and nudity, a ton of profanity, and a bunch of grisly imagery, including descriptions of the crimes. I highly recommend checking out Crime Scene, the Times Square Killer on Netflix. So, are there any cases that you'd like to see covered in a future Crime Scene series? Let me know in the comments below. I'll even pass them along to Netflix in that off chance that they listen to suggestions. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.